Let me get rid of this little panel. All right. Again, thank you, Brooke. And as Brooke stated, my name is Kyle Gray. I'm a manager with the security team here at GSI. Appreciate you joining today's webinar on JDE Best Practices Data Privacy. Today's agenda, we're going to take a look at what data privacy is, why it concerns you, and some how-tos on implementing data security around the pertinent data. We'll recap and then have some recommendations and best practice ideas along the way to that you can try to adhere to. All right, data privacy, what is it? By definition, the high-level layman's terms, it's basically just your personal identifying information, or your PII. You'll hear me reference that PII acronym a few times throughout this webinar, so you know what I'm talking about. Again, layman's terms, it is just personal data for your employees, customers, vendors, potentially contractors, if that's something you track via your address book. And then it's also personal or PII data for HR. So it's housed in address book and HR data tables. And just for the HR, it's typically employee related, which we'll get into some specifics of what each of these data points look like. Personal data security. So how do we take care of our address book and HR data PII issues? From an address book standpoint, we use permission lists. We'll get into that in a minute again and more specific. But they are customizable lists that basically control that particular information and who has access to it. From an HR data standpoint, it's a little bit more intuitive. We recommend using a data source or an additional data source separate from your functional areas. So you have, again, we'll get into this in a second, but you have your JDE system, but you've got data that's inside that system. That data is pointed to certain data sources, servers, if you will, and we recommend segregating that out. So all HR data goes to its own data source, and functional access data for your transactions in JDE migrate to a different data source, and then you're able to segregate that access however needed. So more on PII and what kind of data points we're looking at. So from an address book standpoint, you can see here tax ID. There is an additional tax ID that has a different alias. Address, phone number, email, DOB, gender, and there are 8 other user-defined fields that can house certain data that allow that permission list and data privacy allows you to secure. Of these, and as you can see here, sorry, the HR data, the 2 main areas that HR data is concerned with is the pay rate, which is your SAL alias, and then the SSN, which is your social security number alias. Of these fields, if you will, the JDE data points, the ones that we're most concerned with or that GSI recommends adhering to or adding those additional layers of security that we're talking about today are around your tax ID, the address, date of birth, and then the HR data, which is pay rate and social security number. Not that the others aren't pertinent, but these types of data points that I just mentioned are most crucial to being able to access or create fraudulent behavior either inside the system or outside of the system. So being aware of and adhering to those particular aliases and data points is very important. All right, so search types. So there are multiple search types within the address book. Some of you may already know this, some of you may not, but the most common and commonly used out of the box are your employees, customers, vendors. I did throw contractors in there, which is CO earlier. It is vaguely used, but it has been used, and then obviously that is more of it is an employee for the business, so they would probably house that information for them via a CO search type. There are customizable ones. We don't see this done a lot, but they do have the ability to customize, which obviously needs to be documented within the company so that these search types can be picked up when creating permissions list and segregating out what data can be viewed based on which search type, and then given to the users and roles, which we will talk about here in a few. All right. So heading right in, let's take a look at permissions lists. So there are a couple ways to secure your PII related to data privacy. The first one's going to be the permission list, and that's again related to just the address book. You basically create a permission list that allows or disallows the ability to view that pertinent PII address book data. This is done through P01138 program, which I will show you here in a second. Once a permission list is created, you can distribute that list to a user or role or role. Recommended to do it at the user level for ease of distribution and management, because obviously if you put it at a role, that role could be attached to 20 plus 30, 40 users. And like I said, could be difficult to manage who has access to which data. Now, if it's mapped out and strategized, again, like we'll talk about here shortly, properly, then assigning permission lists at the role level can be very efficient. But again, strategizing is a huge point there. And only one effective list per JDE user. I will get to it in a minute, but for instance, you can only assign one permission list to a user and it be effective, and you can only assign one permission list to a role, a single role, and it be effective. There may be issues where there are multiple roles assigned to a user that have a permission list assigned to them. So user has 6 roles, 3 of them have permissions list. Obviously, one of them is only going to take effect, and that obviously goes by the JDE security hierarchy that you see here. So it would choose the role with the highest sequence number. So whatever permission list that role has, that's the permissions from a PII data privacy standpoint that the user would gain in the system. Something, again, to strategize and be thinking of if we implement at the role level. All right, so combating the HR data PII. We recommend doing a data source, the additional data source. So basically, the data source is just the specific location, as mentioned before, where your data is stored and accessed from. So take our little blue diagram over here. Think of this as our lines here is all our JDE interface. Everything's up in here. We perform transactions in here. We can go in the address book, blah, blah, blah. But what we want to segregate out, and what this diagram shows is, okay, all of our functional access data is going to be routed to this data source on the right. All HR pertinent PI data, which again is our social security numbers and our salaries or hourly rates, we're going to push that to this data source. So anybody transacting in the system or using JDE that does not have access to this data source assigned to them specifically cannot access that particular data in the system. Again, this is the most efficient way to segregate your HR data, but not technically the only. The other option is to insert a column security record, which I'll get into here in a minute on those specific aliases I mentioned. The screenshot down here, you can see this is the P98 OWSEC, or if you're using long passwords, it's the LPSEC now. So it's working with user security. You can see here we pulled up a user ID. Now this is a lot of data sources assigned to one user ID. You really would only need the default, as the system user is JDE, but you simply come in here, click the plus sign, and you're able to add an additional data source. So what it would look like if the data source was created, and that's something we're not going to get into in this particular webinar. There's just not enough time, and that's more of a CNC functionality. But what it would look like is typically you just see this K-Gray, default, and system user JDE. What we would want, the next one would have, if we had a separate data source for our HR data, it would say K-Gray. Data source could be named whatever, HR data, or HR pertinent data, whatever you want to call it. And then system user, they would create a system user for it called HR data. Again, it can be called whatever you want, but keep it systematically between the data source and the system user. And simply that's all you do. So when that data, so now that user would be able to access that data. Anyone that did not have this data source, or that new data source, excuse me, assigned to them would, going back to our blue diagram here, would not be able to access anything in this particular data source. It would only come over here to the right. So hopefully that high level overview helps explain the data source idea and what's behind it. Again, I know there are documents, even potentially white papers on creating data sources, and that's something that GSI could help with. I'll mention that later too, but definitely our recommended remedy for HR data issues. Why data privacy concerns me or you in that matter. I'm going to read this second, and this is just off the kind of the Oracle, the website. I'm going to read this, and then I'll kind of go into the top bullet point. But address book data security feature provides an additional level of security by not allowing secured users to locate valid PII information using the QBE line or query by example. For example, if a user enters numbers in the tax ID field of a QBE line trying to search for a specific vendor or customer, or if they're tracking employees by tax ID, and which does happen, they've entered social security numbers in as tax IDs, then, and if they do not have the ability to see that, then they will not display any data in the grid. So again, that's why, going back to the types of data or data points that the address book and HR data house, the tax ID, the additional tax ID, address, date of birth, and social security and salary, those are right there. Why we don't want any users in the system to be able to pull up that data for anyone other than themselves, and that's what this data privacy and data security allows. It allows them, if done and set up correctly, again, we'll look at some of the high-level setup here in a minute, but if done correctly, it prohibits users from being able to see those certain data points that are defined other than their own. So the top bullet point, why does data privacy and why am I needing to hear and be concerned with this particular stuff? Well, there are corporate regulations and responsibilities that businesses have to adhere to. For one, it's confidence that your customers, vendors, and your employees' pertinent information is secure in your system. They enlist, so if they're vendors or customers, they're doing business with you. They give you that information hoping and knowing or expecting that that information is housed and secured in an efficient manner. And due to that not being the case, the business could be subject to corporate governance guidelines, which there could be stringent repercussions for that. So the why is very important. All right, so I've talked about some of the things regarding what it is. We've kind of defined what type of data we're looking at and where in the system it is. We've described the why of why we need to adhere to this, why we need to keep our minds mindful of this, and now we're going to talk about implementing some how-tos on implementing this type of security. First and foremost, and it's not just the security project team here at GSI, but I would assume any good project team, there's always a strategy session. Develop a baseline info that all users can or cannot have access to, and insert this at Star Public. And the reason I bring this up is because remember the security hierarchy. So user, role, 1, 2, 3, however many they have, and baseline security is Star Public. And that flows into this security setup as well, just like it does for application and action security. If the user does not have a permission list assigned to their user ID, if the user does not have a permission list assigned to any of the roles that are assigned to that user ID, and there are no Star Public blocking records towards a permissions list, that user has full access. And there's no data source, additional data source that that user is not assigned to. So basically, you have nothing in the system from a data security standpoint. That user can see all the data, even if they don't have access to the address book. Some people think that, well, they don't have access to the address book, so that's fine. That's not necessarily the case. And if your users have data browser access, they can get that information. So having it at Star Public, for one, allows across the board, whether they have it at user or role level, that also takes out a human error of, I forgot to assign this permission list to the user level. If that's the way the business chooses to structure this security, I forgot to do that, leaving them open to this types of data. But if you have that Star Public record, then that negates kind of the human error of not assigning it. You then have the base layer of saying, okay, well, they can see, you know, data, or gender, maybe a phone number, and that's about it. It depends on what you have at Star Public, but again, Star Public's a huge record. Outline what specific data needs to be masked, and then grant back to only certain users. So again, kind of piggybacking off of that Star Public, if you have a Star Public record, Star Public affects everyone in the system. So then they're locked down from those tax IDs and all those pertinent data points that I mentioned. Then you have to go back and say, okay, who in the system, because somebody in the system has to manage it and edit it and so forth, who in the system needs the access, and how are we going to grant that access to them? So this is where you see the examples down here. Really, it's your master data management, which is your address book, your customer master, and your supplier master. Those folks and your HR personnel. Those are typically the only personnel that have access to these pertinent types of the data points. Even admin, sysadmin type folks, they should have limited access. There's really no reason. Now they can go into some of these programs that control what users can do, but they should still be, from a sysadmin or the user level, they should still be masked from seeing social security numbers and tax IDs and so forth. No, in our opinion, no reason, unless it's a small company and that sysadmin is, you know, your HR person, which there's, you know, the whole webinar of you know, do's and don'ts around that subject. But unless that person is a sysadmin, absolutely has, you know, those other types of duties within the company, they do not need that type of access. Security strategy, any strategizing, very important. All right, how to implement data security. There's a few main bullet points. You see the address book data security up top, and then the HR data security. Starting with the address book data security, and then we're going to get into some specifics and screenshots and how-tos here in a second. We're going to, again, start with AB data security. So first and foremost, enable address book personal data security. It is disabled by default. Don't really like that, but that's the way JD, it comes out of the box. So you need to go in and enable that. We'll show you here in a second. It's done through the P-Quad-0 program. After that, we need to create a permissions list. As I mentioned earlier, that's done through P01138, and we'll show you the specifics of that. After you've created the permissions list, you need to assign that permissions list. So again, if you're not doing it at Star Public, where it's for everyone, then it either needs to be assigned to a user or a role, or a role. And then there's one other aspect we haven't mentioned yet, but I wanted to put this in there, and we'll talk about a little bit specifics here in a minute too, is the extend controls beyond your address book. So when you are using a permissions list, it is only looking at the address book related tables that control those aliases or those types of data. Extending that, or extending the control to the JDE INI setting, allows the system, when you go to click on, or someone goes to click on a point of data that should be secured that's potentially not in an address book table, it will reference that JDE INI setting, and it will basically say, nope, this permission list right here says that this person can't do that here, so they can't do that over here either. So it's allowing, or it's a very good added layer to have that in there and change that setting so that that it's not just your address book tables that are secured from. And HR data, we did talk about you know, moving data to a separate data source, and you having to set that up separately. And then I'll show you some screenshots of that. And then I mentioned alternatively, if you're not going to set up a data source, or that's not feasible, you do have the option to go in and implement a column security record, which is a view no, so it will block or gray out those particular fields that you want, or aliases, I should say. So you would put that as Star Public Star All, and this would just be towards the HR type data, which is your social security number and your salaries or hourly rates. And obviously, if you go this route, last bullet point down there, you do need to create a role or roles to grant back the access to the users that need it. So HR type roles, you know, master data management, if you have it, type roles, those sorts of things. All right, so let's take a look at some of the specifics on how to do some of those bullet points that I just mentioned. First one was enabling your address book personal data security. Again, this does not come enabled by default. So you will navigate to the P0000 quad 0 program, and the first screen that will pop up is this little system setup screen right here. It's asking you what constants are you trying to update. Obviously, we're talking about address books, so we would click the address book constants, and this screen right here would appear. It is as simple as clicking or making sure, excuse me, this checkbox right here for activate personal data security is checked. That would be unchecked coming out of the box. You check that, you click the green check mark, you've enabled the functionality. And just to reiterate, the functionality should only be granted to admin or HR personnel. All right, so after we have done that, the next step was to create or edit, if you have any out there, permission lists. Something to note, this program I've said I think 3 or 4 times now, P0113A, remember that is your permission list definitions program, the way where you can work with them, create new ones. This is in bold red letters up here. It is only a web client available. So as you can see, I'm going to kind of walk you through down here. This permissions list is kind of a system permission list, so it could be assigned to the sysadmin type folks, or it may be, this one may be going to the star public. You can see here that they've got the different search types. So we talked about search types earlier. You got your customers here, your employee here, your vendors or suppliers here with the B. I'm not sure what the A is, but apparently this company is using A, or this exercise using A, and they've all decided to secure the tax and additional tax. But for this instance, for employees only, they've decided to secure the address, the date of birth, and gender. And then remember, these permissions lists only deal with address book fields. So this, in my opinion, is probably going to go at star public, because they're okay with the customers and vendors address being seen, which typically that's not a huge deal. And then with an employee, they're trying to block everything, which again is typically best practice and considered. So you have multiple options. You can set up multiple search types within a single permission list, or you can break your permissions list out by search type. Again, that just goes back to the strategic planning and overall company desire and setup of how they want to distribute and secure and distribute this type of access. And this screenshot on the right here are all the checked boxes, if you will, options you have. These all correlate to what is in this grid here. This grid format is one that was already set up. If you were going to create one, you'd hit the plus sign, and this is what it would take you to. So you start here. This is what has already been set up in this grid here. Here it is unchangeable. You have to either highlight the line or filter on the SYS or whatever your permission name list is, and then go to row edit permission list as you see here, and then that'll bring this up as well. One thing to note, and I'll show you here in a second, this perm, which is permission perm list relationship, that's where you'd go to assign that permission list to a user or role or star public. And speaking of that, we'll create permissions list relationships. So once you've created your permissions list or lists, and you know that who and what needs are out there for the company, you head to P95922, which is you can fast path to, or as I mentioned, you can use the rower format and use the perm list relationship option from the previous screen. And again, highlighted it here for you. This screen here should look pretty familiar. It's just a, if you're familiar with JDE programs, oops, I'm sorry. Let's go to previous here. 95921 is the user role relationships. 95922 is just the role or the relationships for the permission list. It looks very similar to JDE functionality for the 95921. You've got your permission list in here because you've already found it over here, and you've gone to your permission list relationship. Here you filter on your user or role, or however you want to distribute this. Again, this one has the checkbox for the star publics right here, the radial, because that was this system one was set up for a star public use. You have the option to apply it to any role and any user with respect to keeping one permission list to a role and one permission list to a user assigned. An added protection layer. I discussed this briefly earlier. This is that JDE I&I setting. So while we've masked and created these permissions lists and assigned them, we're feeling really good. You know, our address book data is locked down, and anybody going in address book's only going to be able to see the right data that they need. You know, our system's completely clear. Not necessarily. So that's why we recommend, and I can't highlight it or click, so I'm going to move on, but this first bullet point under the top one is enable data privacy skip record equals true. It is always set to false, so you would change that, and this allows for protection of PII data across all applications or tables in your JDE system, not just your address book ones. So for instance, I went back to my example earlier. If your users have access to data browser and then this feature is set to false, they potentially could backdoor into some of that data. This particular, something to note, this particular change, because it's at the database level, it does require a restart of services to take effect. And I just copied these from, or took these from the Oracle site as well, but true, it excludes records with secured data from all other output sources. So kind of like I mentioned, any other source inside JDE that has this particular data that your permissions lists are set up to secure or govern, when that's set to true, it uses those permissions lists to look across the whole system and say, okay, because this user has this permission list assigned to their user level, or because this user has this role that has this permission list assigned to their user level, I'm looking everywhere in the system where this data is housed, and I'm going to make sure that if this user's trying to click on this, that they cannot access their data, or if they're trying to query, again by the QBE field, that that no data pulls up. And just the adverse, if it's set to false or left blank, which again, this is the default, it allows the records with security data to appear. So just because you have your address book tables and data secure, anywhere else could potentially be seen. Okay, so we talked about data sources. For this instance, let's say you did add it. A data source can be added to an individual user. There's also the all users radio check here. Most likely will not be used. I can't see or have seen where that particular option has been used. You also, as I mentioned, have the ability to assign a data source to a role instead of a user. But you must always specify the system user down here. So this is where this screenshot over to the right should look familiar. Using our K-Gray example again, this one should be the only one. These are all just been added manually. And then the second one you would see, if there was an additional data source, would say HR data. It would be pointed to a different system user and source, obviously. All right, so we're going to recap. We'll go over a couple of recommendations and best practices. This type of security is pretty cut and dry on what you can and can't do with it. Again, it just goes back to that strategic planning and saying, okay, what do we want to lock down from a whole company standpoint? Is there anything? What do we want to segregate from certain parts? What do we want to grant to certain areas? How do we want to construct it? It's almost just like your functional access that you should be, planning your distribution of that the same way you would do this. Address book data security, again, create that baseline permission list that is granted to the whole company, the star public. Additional permissions list assigned to users and roles that need the access to that data, to the specific AB data. You can have, and when I have this bullet point here, multiple permissions list to users roles. You can't have it to users, but you can, again, in my instance earlier, you can have multiple roles assigned to a user ID that have permissions list. In that case, the security hierarchy kicks in, and whatever role is the higher sequence number and gets picked up first, that permissions list will get picked up. So if they're doing a transaction and they shouldn't be seeing that particular data, you potentially could run into an issue where a user's seeing data that they shouldn't based on the security role hierarchy. Again, goes back to the strategy planning, and we need to make sure that there would be no overlapping or gaps in that type of access. Extend beyond address book, like we just talked about, the I&I setting, that's a big one. And there are docs out there on that. It is not a difficult change, and the change can be made and services rebooted and everything be back up within the hour. And one thing we didn't talk about, sorry about that, is utilize queries and watch lists. It wasn't really part of how to do all this, but utilize UDOs. There are UDO webinars out there. We will have one coming up from the security team in the next couple months as well, so be on the lookout. But use these queries and watch lists, because you can set queries and watch lists up around all of your address book tables, the programs, certain data, and you can get notified, you as security admin or admin type person, HR person who really should be only accessing these particular programs and data points. You can get alerted to when people are either trying to or have access and those sorts of things. So again, just another added layer of security or monitoring around this PII data. All right, so our HR data, recapping, set up that additional data source if possible. If not, I'll talk about the column security again here in a second. It's blocked. Once that's done, no user has access to that data source until specifically assigned. So it basically, once the data source is created, is default closed or segregated out. So that's one of the main reasons why that's the recommended best practice, is because there's you have to manually assign that data source to a user. So there really takes away some of the human error as well. Assign to users and roles that need that data and that data only. Again, usually approved, or excuse me, HR type personnel, master data management if you have it, and then maybe approved admin type users. Haven't seen many of those though. The alternative is that column security record. It at least gets you star public, star all tables. That means any table housing the aliases SSN and SAL for salary, which also is hourly. You want to view no record, meaning that that field, whatever programs house that in the system, will be grayed out and they will not be able to see it. And then finally here too, over your HR data, set up queries and watch lists. Even if you have the separate data source, find out when that data source is being added to users. Put a query or watch list over the P98 OWSEC to see user security changes, because that's where the data sources are assigned and created. So again, just added layers of security and protection for the company. All right, so that recaps and closes out the webinar for today on data privacy. But GSI security practice does have some offerings, so take a look at these. If any of these you could use assistance with, have caused you pain points, or you're even just remotely interested in, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to help you. We have a security assessment, security strategy, and design. We do specialize in that. That's one of our key areas that we like to help a lot of our customers out with. Audit and SOX compliance, security optimization. So you think you may have a solid base, but you're missing a few parts. So let's see what we can tweak and optimize. Security process design. How are you handling your day-to-day activities, and what can be done to help with that? We have a full service security implementation team, so we can come in and revamp your whole security if it's just not working, or you've recently failed an audit and you're in the need for some immediate help. And then finally, we have secure care, just like our app care team. We specialize in taking care of client security needs. So they've become the user base has grown, or they got a big company, and instead of hiring a few people to take this on or even train them, because security has become hot in the last few years, that a lot of people know the best practices and how to handle those type situations. So we've specialized in taking care of those activities for clients. So again, if any of these ring a bell, or you would like to inquire on more of these, by all means, please reach out to us. All right, Brooke, question?
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, I just want to cover a few follow-up items, and then we'll move into our question and answer portion of our webcast. Can you see my screen okay, Kyle?
I can, yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. All right, so I just wanted to remind you that today's presentation is part of our free educational webcast series on JD Edwards. And our upcoming webcasts are currently listed on the screen, and we are adding more every day, so be sure to check back at getgsi.com/JD Edwards webcasts. And check out erptalk.com, which is our problem-solving forum where you can get your JD Edwards and other enterprise applications questions answered, as well as answer other people's questions as well. And make sure you stay connected with us on social media. All of our handles are currently listed on the screen, and you can see our most up-to-date posts, webcasts, events, industry insights, and a whole lot more. And we also provide extensive free educational resources for the JD Edwards community, including our webcasts, our monthly newsletter called the GSI Insider, our online resource center, as well as our YouTube channel. We have all of our webcasts out there as well. And we also have on-site and virtual workshops. And if you'd like to sign up for any of our weekly email reminders or our monthly newsletter, you can go to getgsi.com, go to resources and events on the main page, and then select JD Edwards link on the right. All right, so I see we've already had several questions submitted. I would like to remind you that if you would still like to submit a question, there is still time to do so. And if you minimized your GoToWebinar console window earlier, you can just click the left arrow key to redisplay. Okay, Kyle, our first question today is from Danny, and Danny said, is data security across all environments, or is it tied to a specific environment? Kyle, you still there?
Oh, would help. Yeah, it would help if I was unmuted.
Okay.
Yes, good question. It is. Sorry, no, it is environment specific. So you'll want to make sure that, and that leaves you the options to test in lower environments and then implement in production as well.
Okay, perfect. And our next question is from Brenda, and she said, if a user has multiple roles assigned and each role has a permission list, what effect will it have on my user's overall data access?
Good question. Touched on it, touched around this area anyway in the presentation, but it just depends. If there are multiple ones, and it depends on how it's structured, the JD security hierarchy is going to kick in. So they could potentially, depending on the transaction they're performing and what permissions list is assigned to which role and which hierarchy that role is falls under, or sequence number that falls under, they potentially could. That's why I was stressing earlier the strategic planning part, and that knowing where your transactions are, what data is within which transactions, and then being able to segregate that out by role. Remember, though, best practice is to set these permissions lists at the user level, not roles.
Okay, perfect. And then our next question here is from Bill, and he said, our company is subject to audits. Is this material typically covered in JDE system audits?
That's a good question, too. Yes and no. I mean, we hope that it is, and honestly, it just depends. I hate to say that, it just depends on the auditors. So you may have an audit company, and it could be the same company, just different individuals, but an audit company that comes in or has been coming in for 2-3 years, twice a year, quarterly, whatever the structure may be for your audits, and then all of a sudden they're concerned with it, and you failed the audit, or you have points deducted, or however that is calculated because of this. So it's kind of hard to say that yes, every audit looks at this, but I certainly would like to hope so, because this is some of the most pertinent data that you can have in a system, other than shipping product out the door and writing fake checks and stuff. You've got social security numbers and all these tax IDs that we've talked about, addresses, lots and lots of data that are in the system. So I sure hope that all of the auditors are adhering to this, but I would not assume that if I were you. I would adhere to this up front, and then that way it's taken care of, it's masked, and even if they find a gap, the again, point deduction or glitch, whatever you want to call it, on the audit report will not be near as bad.
Okay, great. And then this question is from Ricardo, but he's just asking to go back to the collaborative JDE forum. So Ricardo, let me pull that up for you. It's called erptalk.com. So if you just go to erp-talk.com, and you can go on there and create a username and password, and then you'll be able to get your questions answered and answer other people's questions as well. All right, well, that appears to be, oh wait, one more, I think we have one more question. Okay, you're welcome, Ricardo. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for your great presentation today, and everybody for your questions. And as a follow-up from today's webcast, we ask that you complete a short 1-minute survey when you exit, and you will be receiving a email with a link to our resource center on our website, where you can access a copy of the presentation today, as well as a link to our YouTube channel where we put this video as well. And then after today's webcast, we will do the drawing for the $25 Amazon gift card. And anyone that attended the entire webcast will be eligible to win, and we will notify the winner. And if you do have any follow-up questions for Kyle or myself, our contact info is currently listed on the screen. Let me go back here. And yeah, thank you so much. We hope that you guys have a great day. Thanks, Kyle.
Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.